Deputy Donnelly. Sorry, Minister, would you please? Thank you.
Thanks, Cian Corla. I'd like to thank Minister Bruton, Minister Sherlock and all of the deputies on all sides of the House who contributed to the debate this evening and yesterday. I've listened carefully to the debate and it seems to me that there's plenty of common ground where it matters most, on the fact that there's a big opportunity here to save thousands of companies and thousands of jobs at zero cost to the state. There seems to be agreement from all sides that the current system of examinership in Ireland doesn't work. There have been 4,700 insolvencies in the past 3 years, and only 64 of those have gone down the examinership route. That's about 1 in 73. The ratio in America is about 1 in 8. There seems to be agreement from all sides that fixing the examinership process will save an awful lot of companies and an awful lot of jobs. If we can hit the US ratio here in Ireland, then nearly 600 companies that have closed down in the last 3 years would still be trading today. And there seems to be agreement from all sides on one of the core problems with the current process, namely that it's too expensive for small companies and that the vast majority of this expense is in legal fees. Now, in spite of this common ground, the government's going to vote the bill down in about 9 minutes. And several reasons have been given for this, and I'd like to address as many of them as I can now. The first raised by Minister Bruton was that the proposed changes, quote, would create significant risks that the measures would be unconstitutional. Now, while the challenge of constitutionality is vague, we weren't able to get our hands on the legal advice. One specific area was referenced by the Minister and by other deputies. That is that they were unhappy that the bill gives power to the examiner to write down secure debts and to repudiate leases. The Minister described these powers as, and I quote, unjustified and disproportionate interference in the property rights of those involved, end quote. Under the current legislation, the examiner can write down secure debt to the value of the security against that debt. That is simply being maintained in the new bill. Similarly, leaseholders could be written down between the enactment of the original examinership legislation in 1990 and the 1999 Amendment Act. So both of the issues raised, both serious issues, either exist or have existed in legislation and are constitutional. I have to say, Minister, I don't believe that in this case it is credible to hide behind the Constitution when it comes to voting down this bill. Now, the Minister and several deputies raised concerns that the bill shifts the onus unfairly to creditors, or onto creditors, and in doing so creates an unbalanced examinership process. Deputy Lawler suggested that maybe the bill is anti-creditor. Deputies Doyle and Humphreys very understandably raised issues of creditor SMEs and concerns that they might be put out of business. So I'm going to address the specifics that were raised, but I'd like to just stop for a moment and say, look, this bill was developed over a considerable amount of time by Ross Maguire Senior Counsel, who's a lot of experience in insolvency, by Barry Lyons Solicitor, who's handled more examinerships in the country than everyone else combined in the last 12 years, and by me. Our objective was to reduce the costs of examinership by removing unnecessary court appearances. That was the main objective. Yes, we have addressed other issues that the examiners on the ground are finding are stopping examinership processes, but I can assure the ministers and I can assure the House that at no point were Ross, Barry or myself thinking, let's try and penalise creditors. That didn't happen, and it doesn't happen in this bill. There is one case for secured creditors where they are tied in, and that was brought in specifically because there are some banks who are trying to get their money out of this country, and they are burying viable companies when they do that. The domestic banks aren't. The domestic banks are saying, we won't call in the security now, we'll let this business continue to trade. So, to the specific issues. The first, these are all related to the creditor, and many, many government deputies kept bringing this point up, that this bill penalises creditors, that it is unfair on creditors. And if that were true, I wouldn't be bringing it forward. And I want to try and explain to the ministers and to the House why I don't believe that that bill does this. The first issue raised was that the bill creates high hurdles of proof for creditors who want to go to court. Minister Bruton raised this last night. Now, Minister, I checked this with my legal team, and they said, in fact, the hurdles you raised around things like defrauding the creditor and information material nature not being disclosed. These are exactly the hurdles which are in the existing legislation. So this bill does not change the current burden of proof. The second concern raised around creditors was that the bill creates a situation where a creditor must not only vote against the scheme of arrangement, that's the survival plan, but must also go to court to prove that they have been unfairly prejudiced. This is the current position under the existing legislation, so there is no change there. The third concern, which was raised by Deputy English and many other government deputies, was that if a creditor does not agree to the survival plan put forward by the examiner, the bill would force the creditor to initiate a court case. Minister, you raised this. I think, Minister Sherlock, you may have raised this as well. And the concern is that this makes things more difficult for creditors, particularly suppliers, particularly the SME creditors, to defend their interests and therefore their property rights. Actually, the process and the concerns being raised are concerns and problems with the current process. So we've had, in a rebuttal of what I am proposing, we've actually, somewhat ironically, had a very good critique of problems in the existing process. This bill actually provides new protection to essential suppliers by allowing them to be granted higher security by the examiner if he or she believes that those supplies are necessary for the company to continue trading. Furthermore, the bill makes life easier for creditors, as in the new process, should any creditor wish to initiate legal proceedings, all they've got to do is write to the examiner and tell them, and it is the examiner who deals with all the hassle of setting that up. Thirdly, of course, this process radically reduces the costs of examinership. About €50,000 in legal fees evaporates. Now, at the moment, that €50,000 in legal fees comes out of the company. That goes away. So what happens for the creditors? There's more money. So they get a higher dividend. The fourth reason concerning the creditors was that the bill leaves the creditor to cover their own legal costs when they are challenging the process or the proposed survival plan. This is the current position under existing legislation. The fifth concern, raised by Deputy Barry, was that the bill would see all costs of the legal proceedings borne by the creditor. As per the current legislation, creditors would pay for their own legal costs and no other. We have added a clause that says if the judge believes the creditors are being vexatious and forcing the company into court to bury them under legal fees, which unfortunately, we're being told by the people who are doing this every day, is happening. We've added a clause that says if the judge believes that that's what a creditor is doing, then that creditor will pay the legal costs of the company for that action. Several other concerns have been raised. Deputy Barry believed that the bill gives too much power to the examiner. The bill doesn't give any additional powers to the examiner. It does change the terms of reference within which the examiner works, as has been described, but the examiner does not get additional powers. Deputy Barry also mentioned that the bill doesn't address the qualifications required of an examiner. These requirements are in fact contained in the 1963 Companies Act and in the 1990 Companies Amendment Act, so there's no concern there. Deputy Connaughton was concerned that the examiner can assume the power of company director if they believe the directors are trying to stymie the process. Under current legislation, the examiner enjoys this bill, and in my bill, or in this bill, as in the current legislation, directors have the right to challenge an examiner assuming that power. Deputy Connaughton, Lawler, McHugh, Doyle, Humphreys, and I think others, raised a concern, and a concern I take very seriously, that allowing insolvent firms easier access to writing down debt would in turn damage many other firms in the sector. I want to be very, very clear. This bill does not make it easier for insolvent firms to write down debt. However, by reducing the legal fees of examinership, it provides a higher dividend to those other firms and, critically, keeps one of their customers trading. The result is not more damage to other viable firms, it is less damage. Now, there are others which I don't have time to go into, but I hope all of that makes two things very clear. The first is that the main reasons given for not accepting this bill were identified by us during drafting, and indeed were identified by the Minister during drafting, and have already been dealt with. And the second is that this bill, as it stands, is more than good enough to go through second stage, warts and all, and could be turned into the finished article during the rest of the legislative process. The question then is why vote against it? Why vote against it now? Right now in Ireland, about 4 viable companies a week are shutting down unnecessarily because we don't have an examinership process that works. The time to help them is now, and this bill, Minister, provides that opportunity. If this government wanted to, it could do what it needed to do to this bill. I would work with them, the team I'm working with would work with them, and we could have this in law, protecting jobs, protecting SMEs by June. I believe, sadly, I'm finishing on this, Ceann Comhairle, that the government is not burying this bill because it believes it to be unworkable. I believe that it is burying this bill for political reasons. Earlier today, the Taoiseach stated that the government would not support this bill because it was, quote, legally unsound. That is simply not true. He then implied that the government, astoundingly, would not support the bill because I refused to work with the government. I wanted my name on the bill or something. That's what he said. Obviously, that is not true.
Thank you.
I'm finishing right now, Ceann Comhairle. This is a good bill. It would save thousands upon thousands of jobs. It provides more protection to the SMEs who are the creditors. Two groups of people would lose. I'll admit it. Two groups of people would lose from this bill. Lawyers and foreign banks who are trying to shut down viable companies to get their assets out of the country. Everybody else wins. I commend this bill to the House.
Thank you. I now put the question that the bill be now read a second time. The teachtaí atá héamh na ceiste abadís tá. The teachtaí atá na cine abadís níl. Sílim Gwyn Butcher and guest. Vote on.